Alright, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to talk about the basic interface and how to understand what you're seeing when you're looking at Grasshopper. So, we've covered most of the important things that we're going to need to know in Rhino. And this is going to be a pretty general overview about Grasshopper. We, once again, aren't going to be able to cover every single component. But we'll get through what wires look like, what's a parameter, how things go in and out, what the data stream looks like, and that type of thing. But first, we have to find Grasshopper. If you're on the standard tool set, so this tab, it's going to be this little green circle, says launch Grasshopper. Alternatively, if you use the command line, you can just type in Grasshopper. Now yours will probably take a little bit in order to load. I've already opened this up earlier, so it came up pretty quickly. But what you see will look very similar to this. You may have less components, so things like the spiderweb stuff you shouldn't have. And really anything from Ladybug all the way to a lot of these other things, you probably shouldn't have either. I have a lot of extra plugins. I really need to get rid of some that I don't use that often. But you should only have this level in here, and most of those correspond to functions and things that you can do within Rhino as well. So hopefully there isn't anything too surprising. I do recommend that if you start Grasshopper, you've never used or done anything with Grasshopper before, to go ahead and look at some of these tutorial files. They're really good as far as being simple and really just showing you like how if you mess with one or these other parameters that exists here, how it can change a definition or how different outputs are gonna. I don't use all of the tools that these use very frequently. It's just not part of my workflow all the time that I need to show some graphical data with some of my scripts. But some of this stuff is really useful. I encourage you to spend some time to go and look through these when you can. You can exit out of it though, as I'm going to do. You also might see something down here. It's probably going to be this tutorial things. This is usually just old files. Everything here is greater than a month. I haven't been doing Grasshopper on this computer that much. I've been on my laptop. But everything that you need should be here somewhere. You'll notice too that I opened this up and it kind of popped up as a side screen here. Yours may cover the whole screen. Just reorganize that. Grasshopper always sits on top of Rhino. So right now, if I minimize it, you'll see that Rhino's larger than that. I usually don't actually like that because I may need to change layers and start organizing things. So we're going to just go ahead and change that. And then I'm also down here is where Grasshopper kind of hides whenever you minimize it. So I'm going to just do it in the split screen type view. If you have multiple screens, probably use multiple screens for this, but I'm not recording multiple screens, so we're going to do half and half. All right, so up top, we've got a bunch of tabs here, similar to Rhino, that organize our tools in different types, but mostly based on types of geometry. There are extra things here. In particular, when you start out, this is the parameters tab, so params. A lot of this is how you start taking data from Rhino into Grasshopper. We're going to go ahead and start making some things so I can show you what a basic Grasshopper script can look like. And then we'll start talking about some of the locations and different types of components that exist within Grasshopper. So I am going to start by just coming up and getting a point. We're going to make some really simple stuff. I am literally going to make a line and divide it a little bit. Every line, though, needs 2 points. You can create to set 1 point here and then manually enter it in Rhino, but almost always you're going to be referencing geometry in Rhino instead. So what we're going to do is we're going to just make a couple of points here in Rhino. We'll go ahead and make 4. All right. So one thing you can do, and this is a little strange because points are the only components that really do this. When you right click on this, we can come down here to say set one point. And what that's going to do is going to allow us to just pick one thing here. You'll notice it turned into this little green X. If I click off of it, it's kind of a red X. It's kind of went to the background. This has to do with what you're currently selecting here and what displays over here. There are ways to change this viewport, which we'll get to in a little bit after we make a bit of a more complicated script. But right now, this one point here represents this one point in Rhino. We are going to go ahead and create another point just by dragging that down. We are going to set this one to this one. And so now we've got two of these. So the easiest thing you can make from 2 points is almost always going to be a line. Remember, lines are curves. So if we come up to curve, we're going to find a bunch of tools for that. We're creating something. So there's usually creation stuff is like the second or third box here. In particular, we have primitives. We technically also have splines once we want to get into that. These all have drop-down boxes, and they will kind of explain a little bit more what these are. Line is simply up here. You'll notice that there's like line STL or a line between two planes or fit line. There's a lot of ways to make lines. It's important to kind of get familiar with when you would use those. But for the most part, starting out, thinking of a line as 2 points is fine. So we're going to click that and put it here. So you'll notice right now that I've got these points, which were originally orange, but are now silver or gray. These are active components. They actually represent things. This one is orange though. Right now it doesn't represent anything. There's nowhere in the scope of Rhino that it's making something. You'll also notice that you have these little handles on the side of each of these components. Almost all components have some sort of handle on both sides, and definitely at least on one side for the most part. These are how you put data into a component or take data out of a component. So the left side is going to be putting things in, and the right side is going to be going out. This is just to make the data stream flow from left to right. If you're familiar with Arabic, that might be a little confusing since they read right to left, but most people go left to right. So a real simple operation that we can do is take the first point, and you'll see that my mouse kind of became this little arrow thing. Click it and then drag it, and you'll see that we start creating a wire that comes out. And once we get close to the component, we can go ahead and put it here. So right now we've got the wire coming out. This is still giving us an error, and this little box here will tell you what error it is. It's saying input parameter B isn't collecting anything. So we haven't met the conditions for this component to really do any work. So we'll have to put that second point there. So now we have created this line from these 2 points. By the way, I have a little timer thing here. It is going to be in the canvas widgets. It is called the profiler. It just tells me whether one of the scripts I'm making is taking a lot longer in a certain area. You can turn that on if you want, but don't worry about it. Also, if you're seeing this and you're not seeing icons, you're seeing like words, that is here, draw icons. I would generally recommend to get used to both because as you search for things, you'll see both of them. I am actually going to turn on something called bifocals to help you guys with that though. All right, so this labels what these are while you get used to these icons. This is a plugin you can download if you want to use it, but really it's just a reference for you as you guys are learning to know that, this is line, this is point, if you're not familiar with an icon. But yeah, very simple parametric definition here. The goal with parametrics is that whatever you're trying to create here is based on some more primitive or some gathered data beforehand, and that you can change some of these early parameters without having to remake everything each time. So instead of us creating a line every time we want to move one of these points, if we just move one of these, you'll see that the line is going to follow. In the simplest way, this is what a parameter or a parametric solution or algorithm is going to do. It's going to take some parameters at the beginning, and it's going to spit something out at the end. That's really it. So this is good, but this is also very simple. So this probably takes longer to make in Grasshopper than it does in Rhino. So where does this start getting useful? Now, we can keep defining each individual point every time, but it would be great if we could kind of like group them together. So right now we've got this line, and we want to make another line here. I'm just going to select this set of components, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. And right now this is totally the same, but I'm going to go and set this point to here. And I'm going to set this point to here. So pretty easy, but still not really the fastest thing. From this point, we're going to start adding more components as they start coming down the stream. So I'm going to try to keep it very basic, and I will start pulling out some things to show you what Grasshopper sees, because it is different than what Rhino sees. But let's say I wanted to create a bunch of lines in between this. Like I wanted to create a ladder. So let's move these things closer to make it proportionally more ladder shaped. There's a set of tools that you can use to do an operation on this. In particular, because we're modifying something on a line, we're going to go into curve. And this section here called division has a bunch of tools that do exactly that. They divide things. You can divide things by contours, which some of you will find very useful. You can divide curves into equal lengths. So, if you need everything to be 2 foot, it's like, where does that 2 foot hit every time? By distance. So that's going to be if you're measuring along that curve, or if you're basically using a compass to separate out the distances where those fall. And then divide length would be like if you have a very specific length to use. So divide curve is going to be like, I need this 10 times. I need 10 equal things that make this. That's what you'll use. Divide length will be, I need this to be made out of 1 foot sections. That would be what you would use. We're going to go ahead and just divide curve normal. So you'll see that as we keep moving on, these start getting a little bit more complicated. You start having things like curve and count and kinks. These are options for each of these components. It's like, what do you want to do at these points individually? For now, ignore this one. We're going to keep this set to false. But we will have curves that we want to put together. So we're going to want to first start out with this curve. You'll notice that it has automatically divided this. This number here already has a locally defined value. This means that even though there's nothing plugging into it, it has data there. It is set at 10. We can change that with a parameter. We can either create a number and just plug it in. We can right-click directly and set the integer, say 15. We can type out a number in a box and plug that in, or we can use something like a slider to do that. So we're going to go back to parameters. So parameters are most of the basic plugins. So geometry is all located here. It's where you have points, vectors, circles, curves, boxes, breps, etc. We will talk about some of this vocabulary more in detail later. But these are going to be things that generally exist within Rhino. Then over here we have primitives, and we'll have things like booleans, integers, numbers. So some of this is going to sound very mathy to you. It is. You're going to have to brush up a little bit on some of your vocabulary, but Boolean things are going to be like true or false. Integers are going to be whole numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Numbers themselves can have decimal points, so this will be like 0.5 or a half or quarter. and then things like text. There's more complicated things like color, which in the tutorials you'll find several uses of this. Domains, which is going to give you a range where things can be, and other things. Once again, you're going to be able to find most of this type of stuff by hovering over here and seeing what it wants. So like this says it's a number of segments. You'll even see that it has that symbol for the numbers parameter here. So that's one reason I recommend you guys to get used to using the icons, because they're used elsewhere in the program. We also have inputs here. Inputs are things that are kind of variable. So this little thing here, this panel, basically a notepad, like a little sticky note. If you click on it, you can create a little yellow box and put things into it. In this case, let's put 5. I'm going to just shrink it down because I don't need to be that large. So if I plug this in, it will overwrite whatever is in here. So now we have 5 segments. Quick shortcut, if you know what you're looking for, there are certain keyboard shortcuts for this, but you can also treat this like the command line if you know the name of something, where you can double click. It will search for a keyword. You can do things like line. You'll see it brings up a bunch of different line things, just like the command line in Rhino kind of does with similar commands. Or panel. That comes up there. And then there's even other shortcuts, which you just may want to pay attention. If you see me do something quickly, it's like, what was that keyboard shortcut? If I just hit that quote, it will make a panel on its own. And if you want to just put something in it like 7, there it is. And by the way, if you just select something and then hit delete, it will delete it. It's pretty easy. Okay, so this seems pretty simple. If you're used to Revit, they have a thing where you can do this for arrays, and there is even a parameter there that you can click on, but this can apply to a lot of different things. What starts to become more useful are other inputs like number sliders. I'm going to go ahead and put one down. The default number slider goes from 0 to 1, and it has 3 decimal points of accuracy to it. Don't worry about tolerances quite yet while you're learning this. As you get more advanced, you'll understand why to maybe not do 3 decimals or why to do more. But this is the basic one. If you double click on a slider, you can manually enter in something here, but it has to be within the domain of the slider, in this case between 0 and 1. If you double click here, you'll get this big box that allows you to set things differently. So right now it's floating point numbers, so these are basically real numbers. You can make them integers, in which case it can only be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in this case, the minimum and maximum are 0 and 1, so you really only get 2 choices. Only even numbers and only odd numbers. Surprisingly useful in certain contexts, but we'll get to that when we get to it. You can also name different number sliders things, which is really useful if this represents how many, say, chairs need to fit within a certain area or something, if you're organizing them on a line. You can change your domain here just by clicking into it and then making it larger or smaller. I'm going to put this at 20 and then hit that checkbox. You can also, click and drag in order to change this. And then, this range here is going to give you what that difference between the two is. You can also make number sliders by just kind of typing in a number. So if you just type in 5, it's going to assume you want something between 0 and 10, and it's an integer. If you do 5.0, it will do basically the same thing, but now you get that extra decimal point. So that's a quick little shortcut. There's other things you can do, like setting your domain here manually. So doing little ellipses and then saying, 50. And then you can set your accuracy there too. That's 0 to 50. And you can do this for negative numbers as well. Anyway, all to say, we have a number slider. We can change this. So if we plug this into here, so right now it's 7, it's replacing a 7, nothing's changed. We're going to go ahead and start just messing around with this to subdivide it a little bit greater. So this is where some things start to get a little bit more responsive. It's like, this is not enough. This is too much. You can start setting certain parameters here that you need. I'm going to get rid of these panels and move this up. If you see these lines coming up, it's a tool called Snapping Gecko. It's very useful, but, not to like freak you out with more things. All right, so we're dividing this one line 10 times. What if we wanted to divide this line by the same amount of times? We could copy and paste this whole thing and then just plug this line into it, and that would do this. But now when I change one, it only changes this one. So it's not really the most efficient thing that we want to do here. So we're going to get rid of this portion. You can merge data in Grasshopper. In this case, I am going to put my mouse over and I'm going to hold shift. You'll notice it turns green, it has a little plus. And I can kind of just put this into the same thing. We're basically saying, yeah, do this to both these things, not just the one. And so now we get all these points and they should track like this. I'm going to open up a panel, not to type things in, but to show you what's coming out actually. So notice that it has the little handle on the side here. If I go and I just say line, it's going to give me kind of a list, like it looks like an Excel thing. It's like, okay, there's a line, it's this long, that's fine. If I do a point, it's going to give me, okay, there's a reference point here. But if I come here to this point, well, now it's giving me a lot of other things. So referenced items are generally going to say that, oh, I've been referenced. They don't give a defined location. But because we're creating this in Grasshopper, this is now looking at wherever this original location was and then doing math to figure out where all the new ones are. So if I take, and I'm going to hold control here to get rid of one of these, you'll notice that it's got these 10 points. As I increase or decrease this, that list grows or shrinks. We'll actually put this down to like 6 so that we can see it a little bit easier on screen here. So that's good. This is just giving us an X, Y, and a Z. That's just how it encodes point data. If I put this one into it, you'll notice that it is basically the same list just a second time. So what we're doing is we're not making everything like just one long list. It's actually separating things out. We're not going to get too deep into this session, but this is a really important thing, how Grasshopper decides to divide and distribute data. So just be aware that whenever things start coming out, if like you're missing data, you might want to look to see if, okay, do I have the right number of lists here? Is that correct? Anyway, so now we've got, actually, we'll keep this up. I'm going to move it up here. So now we've got like this list of points and this list of points. Well, that's great. But what can we do with these points? Well, there's a couple of things. One is we can start to essentially export them out. So we could take whatever this data is and then come here to bake. And you'll notice that these layers are the same as these layers. So I just right clicked on that. I'm gonna go and put them in layer 1. It's my, actually, let's put it in 2. My layer 1 is red right now. Okay. So now you'll see that I do have a point here that I can kind of manipulate. I'm going to turn off Grasshopper view right now, but we have all these little pink points across the screen. But those exist now within Rhino. If I move them, you'll notice that it's still calculating the point here. Like this is still in Grasshopper. These have just been brought into Rhino. One thing to remember is that once you bake something, it's no longer there. Like if you start messing with it, you're not going to mess up things on this side, but you also won't be able to manipulate them anymore. Baking is usually that thing you do at the end, just like with cookies. So I'm just going to Control Z to get rid of that Grasshopper bake up here. Okay, so we have a set of points here. That's good, but I need to start making these into different things. So while eventually we'll get to a point where we can go ahead and just take this data out and start messing with it, it's going to be a little bit easier for us to do one of the previous things we had where we had separate sets of data. One thing to be aware of is that these are solid black lines. Well, really, these are solid black lines. And this one is a dashed line. Rhino or Grasshopper uses this different type of nomenclature to signify that there is different types of data going into this. So if I take one of these out, you'll notice that now this is a double line. Single lines mean there's one thing coming in and out of it. There's one line. There's one point. Once you get to this double dash thing, it's like, okay, I have a list of 6 things. This double line here is basically telling you, yeah, it's only one list, but there's 6 of them. So there's more than one. If we add this into here, this dash line is starting to tell us, okay, you've got more than one list. This is no longer the easiest thing for us to understand. It will start processing each list separately. Just be aware that if you start seeing this pop up and you're not intending to be manipulating multiple lists, then at some point you will have to fix how many lists you have. But we're going to go ahead and just copy. We're going to keep these as kind of separate lists. We want this type of line coming out of them right now. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. And I'm just going to put this line here. So similarly, when I was complaining about not being able to control these, this number slider can go into as many things as you want it to. So this effectively does the same thing as whenever we had it going into this. So we've got 2 lines, or two sets of points on lines. Now I want to make a line in between each of those points. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this line component that we've just used, and you'll notice that when I copied it, it kind of pulled these handles with it. When you copy and paste things, it assumes you're using the same input, but we can do a new one too. I'm going to take these points here and put them into A. Once again, this isn't going to make anything. Point A, there's 6 point A's, but there's no point B's. Now I'm going to take these and put them into B. So now you'll see that these have started to build something new. They've kind of created this lattice work between these 2 points. Well, great. The really important thing here is that these are still only based on these original 4 points. Grasshopper builds literally everything else within it. Only thing that exists in Rhino right now are these 4 points. So if I move this, it will change. And it will change. And it will change. And, beware that you can change things quite a bit and start breaking things. Or fixing things. You might be going for a spirograph type thing here. But you can start manipulating and handling that stuff. So that's a very, very basic script. This kind of shows you, where you can start from, how components work, and then how certain lists start working. So you can start understanding what the visual vocabulary is here. Within Grasshopper itself, we looked at parameters for a lot of things, and we know some curves. Math is going to be this entire section that basically gives you pluses and minuses. It's so if I wanted one of these things to have more points, so we're just going to make one have 5 more points than the other, because why not? So this is 11, this is 5, this should be 16, and lo and behold, our result is 16. We can put that into this number now. It's based off of the same thing, but that one will always have 5 more of them. But notice that when I do that, this last point goes to all these 5 here. So we're starting to get into more complicated things of how each of these components sorts through and uses data to make things fit. But addition is going to give you the ability to do, or the math area is going to allow you to do basic mathematics. Things like mass addition, it's adding all of the things. Like if I wanted to know what the length of every line here was added together, which is good if you're like buying lumber to know what the minimum amount you would need is. Things testing whether stuff is equal, making a number negative based on a different positive number, etc. There are script things up here. I am not a great coder myself. I will find code online if somebody develops a tool and use it, but I don't do this that much. There's some trig options here, some time options too, and then other utilities that you can use. Domains are going to be very much a thing that we come back to. They're very important, but not quite yet. But math is going to be doing really math things. Also, sets are another thing that's very more theoretical math involved, between things like set theory, but it's also how you start figuring out how to like start manipulating this list directly. This is essentially the Excel portion of this program. These tools are super helpful, but they start becoming very Excel-like. You start feeling like an accountant whenever you start getting into managing things like this. We will talk about them later. Sequences are going to be, if you want to create, a series of numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4 for a certain amount, you can do that there. You can use like trues and falses to cull things in patterns, or you can get rid of the first thing or the fifth thing of a set of different data. There's some things for making Fibonacci sequences or repeating your data if you run to the end, or even random data. This is a bit beyond where we're going to be talking right now. This is, depending on what you're trying to build in Grasshopper, very, very useful, but can also just be confusing when you're starting out. Some text tools and then tree tools. A lot of these are very, very useful. The flip matrix tool early on starts to be useful, but entwine and merge are as well. But as you start getting to really complicated data, you will have to start using some of these tools to help control and manage it. This tab is vectors. This is going to be things, there's like some random stuff here, like grid is kind of a weird thing, I think, as well as like random populate. But there are attractor fields here, but most of the time you're going to be using these things. This is like points, so very simple mathematical geometry. And then a vector is going to be a point, a direction, and amplitude. And then planes. So this is going to be like your construction planes, or how you orient things. Curves. This one we kind of looked at before, but there's some analysis, like figuring out where the centroid is, what are the endpoints, etc. Things like division, where you manually divide certain things, or you break them apart. Primitives, which are going to be circles and lines and other types of easy to make shapes. Splines, which are going to be, the same thing as curves. What we usually call curves in Rhino. Technically, they're all curves, but there's a handful of different things like making the thing in the middle or making a geodesic. We'll talk about these as they start becoming important. Mostly this stuff up here is going to be more important. And then other utilities, things like flipping a curve, like changing it backwards, extending things, joining them, offsetting. So, and generally this analysis, division, making things, and then utilities, that's going to carry over into stuff like the surfaces, where it's analysis, making stuff, and then utilities. We will talk a little bit more later about what a brep is, like what is this geometry. because it starts to be how it understands surfaces and solids. Brep is a more general term. And then meshes has a lot of that. You probably won't have polyhedron here, but you will have some tools like triangulation and these utilities. Once again, I'm going to have more of these because I spend an unfortunate amount of time fixing meshes. But we'll talk about what type of plugins and stuff can help you like get more tools out of this once we start getting into using meshes. Intersect is going to be doing math in between different types or multiple pieces of geometry. So mathematical stuff is like finding where a line and a line intersect, or contours. Like literally, if you have a surface, this is what you use in order to like make the contour lines. It just cuts everything at a certain distance. This can be very useful whenever you're still deciding like what material I should make something out of. You can bring in meshes and just use this tool very quickly and easily. Physical stuff is going to be some collisions. It's separated into this because the way NURBs work tend to be both mathematically defined and precise, but also not precise when you talk about them in Cartesian coordinates. So they do all right, this is pretty close. This is within tolerance. That's why this isn't a separate category, but it's essentially the same thing as mathematical intersections for most of our purposes. Regions here are going to be things like splitting and trimming objects, and then shapes here are going to be like solid intersection. These are the Boolean unions and stuff. They work mostly the same as the Rhino counterparts. Be very wary of using these too much. Once you start getting really complicated amounts of data, these will break. These will break a lot. Transform is going to be stuff like moving and copying and arraying and rotating or refining things. These are also very useful. They almost always require some sort of vector component for the basic transformations. We'll get into them as we move forward. Just if we look at this basic one though, you'll notice that there is something that I think or thought originally should have been here but wasn't. There's nothing that says copy. In Grasshopper, when you move things, you're actually copying them to a new location most of the time, because you can just take the data from the old thing and the new thing and use both of them. So just be aware, like if you get stuck on, I need to copy this thing over here, you want to move something over there. You don't want to copy it to that location. And then display, the final thing here is going to have things like colors, like how to define them, to add dimensions onto things, other types of graphs that you can start pulling data from. So like if we did line lengths, we'll do a bar graph here. So every line is going to have, any simple line will have a length with it. This will start telling us, how many of them are about the same size or, larger. So there's like 2 that are here, there's 0 in this range, etc. And then things like vector display, which is very useful, but we'll get to that when we start messing with vectors a little bit more. Aside of that, there's a ton of plugins and stuff, most of which can be found at Food for Rhino. We'll go over some of which ones we will be probably using in the class, or which ones are just generally useful. But this is a good basic overview of finding your way around Grasshopper, getting used to things. We haven't made anything really complex yet. This is still at a level of, it probably would have been just as fast to make by hand. But as we start making these things into solids, or making circles, or creating other things that are based on every other point, or maybe I want to do every third, or I want to do a different pattern. That's where a lot of the power of parametrics start coming in, because making a function here is a very linear thing. Making a actual thing over here, like each piece of geometry, is a multiplicative thing. So while this may take 2 minutes to do, this may take maybe less time than 2 minutes, but let's just use 2 minutes. 2 minutes for each operation. And so it becomes 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So the goal here is, at the end of the day, doing something that both allows you to move quickly and still be responsive, so that you can make changes kind of on the fly without having to worry about, I have to do all this work again. But also to just be more efficient and start thinking of buildings and architecture and really just geometry in this efficient manner. That will change how you design things. We can decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We'll have that discussion in class. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what to be prepared for, what the type of interface you're going to be staring a lot when you're doing homework is going to look like, and hopefully kind of just makes any other resources you find a little bit more palatable, because you've done something that's very simple, but really everything is going to be lots of wires and connecting things at the end of the day. Anyway, thank you and good luck.